Most spy agencies include some form of basic lockpicking course as part of their operative training, typically called something such as silent infiltration or surreptitious entry. The most basic part of this is the single pin picking or SPP, as well as raking. The two techniques briefly covered herein. Welcome to Tradecraft Sunday. Spy agencies quickly realized that there was a need to be able to enter a location or some sort of vault undetected. We've seen that as recently as February 2022, when Ukraine's SBU detained a GRU agent in Odessa who, among others, was sharing some simple lockpicking tools, specifically 2 tension wrenches and a rake. Don't worry if you don't know what those are, we'll cover them in this episode. Even in the CIA's online museum, we can find this entry, again containing a rake and a tension wrench. Actually, we'll do a dedicated episode for this entire kit in the near future to present it in more detail. All of that goes back to the early days of all of those intelligence services. As an example, in the book William Colby and the CIA, The Secret Wars of a Controversial Spy Master from 2009, we read, within the fortnight, the Office of Strategic Services trainees moved to a facility about 50 miles north of London, an estate called Milton Hall in the county of Peterborough. Here the Jedburgh's training began in earnest. Men learned lockpicking from a paroled British burglar. And this can also be confirmed by the book Spycraft, The Secret History of the CIA Spy Techs from Communism to Al-Qaeda, where we read, during World War II, the OSS created a surreptitious entry capability by enlisting former second-story men with prior experience in burglary, lockpicking, and safe cracking. OSS created and issued a small lockpicking knife containing picks instead of blades that could be conveniently carried in the operative's pocket for quick access when needed. The original OSS surreptitious entry manual cited the purpose for their work as helping the agent solve his problem. He wishes to obtain access to secret documents, copy or memorize their contents, and leave the premises in the same condition as he found them. Actually, right here is a replica of that OSS lockpicking kit mentioned in the book. We have a saw blade, a curved pick, a tension wrench, 2 different kinds of rakes, along with a case that can be easily concealed almost anywhere. Of course, we don't want to make this into an academic exercise, so let's dive more into the details of a typical pin tumbler lock, by far the most widely used type of lock for several decades now. The lock has a cylinder, known as the plug, which is blocked from rotating due to a series of small pins that have to be properly aligned in order to allow it to rotate and thus unlock. In its simplest form, each driver pin, as they are called, has a spring pushing them downwards, and under the driver pin is the key pin, basically the pin that the key is touching. What the right key does is aligning all of the key pins inside the plug and the driver pins just above the shear line, thus allowing the plug to rotate freely. Apparently there are destructive methods to bypass this, but as the OSS manual stated, the point of spy agencies employing lockpicking techniques is to perform a clandestine activity, meaning there should be no indications that the action happened. Reminder, this is the simplest kind of design. There are various other tricks that manufacturers use to make lockpicking harder, but as in the spy agency's introductory classes, let's start with this. To pick this, we need to emulate what the key does And the best way to deeply understand that is the SPP, the single pin picking, where we select a pick with an appropriate angle to allow us to push the pins high enough, and also a tension wrench, also known as torsion bar. Unlike the legitimate key that is used both to align the pins and as a leverage device for us to rotate the plug, in picking we have to do both of those independently. Actually, a common mistake that new pickers make is keeping a constant, steady pressure on the tension wrench. In reality, you want to have enough pressure that the pins you picked are stuck in their place. But if you push a pin too high, you need to provide a tiny counter rotation. In other words, slightly release the pressure on the torsion bar to allow the pins to fall back to their place. Ideally, only the pin that was too high. The audio and pick feedback are crucial to understand this. Here is an example. Listen carefully as the driver pins are stuck over the shear line. This is what happens when you don't put enough pressure on the tension wrench. Now let's do it correctly. Click on 1, nothing on 2, nothing on 3 and 4. Click on 5, click on 2, click on 3, and click on 4. Based on that, you probably realize that if the lock is locked multiple times, we'll have to repeat that process for each rotation. In the early 2000s, expert locksmith Zhiqin Li came up with another SPP tool which had a different intention: to allow people to train on lock picking. That's the Lishi tool, and there are many variants depending on the lock. Actually, here it says 2-in-1. That's because apart from picking a lock, it also has this chart that allows you to decode the cut and create your own keys for this lock. Practically, this entire tool acts as a frame with an integrated tension wrench and a single pick here. This allows new people to lock picking to quickly obtain the necessary dexterity skills, as well as being able to decode locks so that they can produce their own keys for them without having to disassemble the lock. Due to its design, Lishi tools needs far less attention than the traditional SPP on the tension wrench pressure control. This means you can master the picking part with this and then use a conventional tension wrench to improve your skills there too. Here is a demo of it. Clearly, SPP is neither fast nor an efficient technique. It requires practice and skill, and it's not easy to achieve under the pressure of real-world operational environments. However, it's the first thing that is taught because it allows the practitioners to have a deep understanding of the lock and not rely on gadgets or luck. For the same reason though, it has limited practical application for spy agencies, as there are smarter ways to pick or bypass such locks. Before we continue with rating, you might be wondering, but do spies actually use lock picking in real life? There are countless examples, but let's look at two. an older and a more recent one. In the book, American Spies, Espionage Against the United States from the Cold War to the Present, we read about Robert Lee Johnson, an American serviceman who, while serving in Berlin, Germany in the 50s, he was recruited by the KGB and became a Soviet spy. With the help of KGB surreptitious entry experts, Johnson worked his way past each of the 3 locks. He first made a wax impression of one lock, found the combination of the second one misplaced in a desk drawer, and used a KGB X-ray device to penetrate the remaining lock. Armed with easy access to the secrets inside, Johnson routinely emptied the contents of the vault and passed them to KGB officers waiting nearby. After the Soviets photographed the materials and resealed the pouches, they returned the stolen documents to Johnson, who would lock them back in the vault. That was a textbook clandestine operation for intelligence gathering, and as you can see, there are smarter ways to overcome locks instead of SPP. That book also highlighted another key point that leads us to our second story. Although most spy agencies teach their operatives lockpicking, all spy agencies have surreptitious entry experts that are masters of the craft. It's those experts that take up the challenge of lockpicking problems in operational environments. Such an expert is Clint Emerson, former Navy SEAL who worked for the NSA and later became a member of the TAC Devron 5, formerly known as the Development Group or Dev Group, Black Squadron, and even further back known as SEAL Team 6, Black Squadron. This unit is the command's spies, and Clint Emerson has donated several of his items from his time as a spy to the International Spy Museum. Among them is this, a jacket from Egypt with hidden pouches containing all sorts of surreptitious entry tools, including lockpicks. As per its museum label, wearing this blazer, Clint Emerson looked like any other businessman on a workday. Nobody would have suspected that his ordinary-looking jacket concealed all the tools he needed for surreptitious entry. Emerson modified this off-the-rack blazer to suit his needs. Among other tools, it includes his thumb turner, which he could slip into a door crack to unlock a turnable lock. Emerson's tactical blazer, containing lock-picking kit, thumb turner, viewfinder scope, and CCD miniature camera. United States, 1994 to 2014. Clint Emerson was one of those surreptitious entry experts in recent years, and he has shared some examples of what his work entailed in interviews and podcasts.
There was a target I went to that made me realize you have to understand colonization of an area. Who would have thought? A SEAL going, what's the history of this country? What is the colonization of this country? Oh, well, you can go up to the door and there's an Italian lock. There's a British, like basically a British standard lock. And then there's a 5-pin tumbler all on one door, right? And you have to assume all 3 are being used, and all 3 work very different than the other, right? They're all completely different lock systems. So you're like, holy shit, I didn't expect that. Go back, start doing some studying, start going, hey, call up your Brits, my buddies over there, and go, hey, we need to come over and, learn these British standard locks because they are a pain in the ass. Now, for them, it's no big deal.
You put them on a quick set or a Schlage or whatever, and they're like, what the fuck?
Right. Now, 5-pin tumblers for them, is probably, it's a less of a question mark than British standard locks. Those are old school, what you see skeleton keys are used for, and they have these big, they're not pins. They're like these plates inside that move at different heights. And it's a totally different way to try and get past a British standard lock than it is a 5-pin tumbler that we're used to here in the United States. But bottom line is, when you really look at how much there is that you have to collect, it's almost overwhelming. And, and that's not even counting the target themselves. So, when you look at the target, the human going in and out of that vehicle, that structure, that container, that vessel, it becomes kind of the
smallest piece,
the smaller piece, because you really have to understand that neighborhood, that harbor, that skyscraper, and then you narrow it in, but you're keeping track of everything the whole time. So that's why I started with saying it's one of the most challenging operations to pull off and maintain a level of covertness and clandestine that's out there. I mean, at least in my experience, it was one of the most challenging, but also probably one of the most fucking adrenaline flowing, fucking, it's one of the coolest damn things.
Makes everything else seem fucking boring.
You go in and you're like, holy shit, and it's just you, and all that success and all that failure is always 1 second away from, being your greatest or your worst moment. I mean, it's...
Now that we covered SPP, let's look at raking. In the photos we shared from the CIA's museum, Clint Emerson's jacket, the OSS lockpick, the GRU agents captured equipment in Ukraine, and so on. You probably noticed that all of them had picks that looked like this. This is called a rake. There are many different designs. Statistically speaking, the more bumps they have, the more pins they will be able to move in a single movement. Nevertheless, some rakes are more effective for certain types of logs. Unlike SPP, which requires meticulous process and attention, raking is partially relying on trial and error. What you do is rake all the key pins back and forth while keeping pressure on the torsion bar. You keep on repeating the process until they are all sitting properly and the shear line is clear. For most simple tumbler logs, raking works surprisingly well. Here is an example. This is a training padlock using a 6-pin tumbler mechanism. You can ignore this here. This is for the padlock's mechanism. It's not a pin that we can pick. And here is how raking this 6-pin tumbler lock looks like. This is why even unskilled intelligence operatives prefer having a rake and a tension wrench instead of attempting SPP. It's a low-skill lockpicking procedure that can actually work in the field. Back to Clint Emerson, in his book 100 Deadly Skills, the SEAL Operative's Guide to Eluding Pursuers, Evading Capture, and Surviving any dangerous situation. As he writes, the most common lock in the world is the 5-pin tumbler lock, very pickable with practice. Note that this was on the page describing how to improvise lockpicks from paper clips. And he also provides a very valuable tip of surreptitious entry in the next page, where we read that picking is always the last option. A lock that is picked open must be picked closed. Actually, his company even produced this lockpick set. It's likely not his design, but you can find the same design sold by others too. But it's a modern and bulkier version of the OSS one we presented earlier. Before closing, we'd like to quote another book which gives further insight into how the average intelligence officer was trained in lockpicking by the CIA. We want to highlight that since the surreptitious entry experts are training constantly on all sorts of locks, alarm systems, and similar systems to identify weaknesses and exploit them. The following is not for them, it's for the average intel officer. The book that this quote is coming from is Protectors of Privilege, Red Squads and Police Repression in Urban America from 1992, and it says, beginning in the 60s and 70s, the CIA conducted police training courses for close to 7 weeks in such subjects as surreptitious entry, photo surveillance, and audio surveillance. The first of these consisted of instruction on surreptitious entry planning. This 10-day course was designed to instruct the students in the theory and practice of clandestine entry. The prospectus states the student will fabricate a set of lock-picking tools and will learn how to employ them against a variety of luggage, lever, wafer, and pin tumbler locks. In addition, the students were required to participate in practical work exercises and, at the conclusion of the course, in a field exercise. The CIA's training branch insisted on a practical demonstration, hands-on participation of what the trainee had learned through the entire range of courses. For this purpose, the prospectus called for a sort of graduation exercise. The students had to survey, case, and penetrate 3 safe sites, structures used by the CIA for instructional purposes, using surreptitious entry, photography, and audio surveillance. In addition, the agency offered what might be called a graduate course, 10 days in duration, in key surveillance areas. Although this talks about the CIA, the same applies to most spy agencies out there. However, in practice, such tasks are typically given to surreptitious entry experts and not the average intel officer. In conclusion, surreptitious entry is a mandatory skill for several espionage activities, from bugging operations to stealing or photographing physical objects, installing tracking devices, and so on. And the most fundamental part of that is the SPP and rating that we have demonstrated in this episode.